you were given Israeli citizenship. In fact, there are Arab, ethnically, people who are Israeli citizens. I met one of those one time. And of course, being the dumb hick from Arkansas, I didn't know the difference between a Jew and an Arab. And so I asked him if he was Jewish, and I don't think I kind of offended him. But he was an Israeli citizen, but he was an Arab. And so there have been generations after generations of Arab people who are Israeli citizens. And so if you lived in that area where the lines were drawn, you were immediately given Israeli citizenship with all the benefits. The United States, on that same day, President Harry S. Truman recognized Israel as a nation. There's a whole story behind that, which I read. And it wasn't a unanimous decision to recognize Israel as a nation. In fact, President Truman kind of stepped out there without the support of Congress and just did it. And he just said, I'm doing it. And so he did. And so the United States has always been a friend, but they've not always been a close friend of Israel, even historically. Next slide. So May 15th, so this is tonight we're going to be talking a lot about the wars. So on May the 15th, which is the next day, an Arab alliance attacked Israel. The countries involved: Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Lebanon, and then there were other Islamic military forces like the Islamic Brotherhood. There were others. They have all kinds of odd little names, but overwhelming numbers, and they came against Israel. And I misspelled Israel on that next line, but put that R in there. Israel calls it the War of Independence. The Arabs calls it, it's an Arabic word, Nakba, meaning the catastrophe. An interesting story about that term was that first got its origin from a journalist, an Arab journalist, but he wasn't writing it from the perspective, this was really close to when it happened, he wasn't writing it from the perspective that Israel caused the catastrophe, but the Arabs did. And he basically wrote that story using that terminology, which became very popular because it was the Arabs that made the mess. And he was an Arab journalist writing for a Jordanian Arab newspaper. Well, there had been fighting. In fact, has there ever been a time when there wasn't fighting? From the early 1900s, there was fighting going on. So when we get to the time and I start talking about all these wars, I'm really just going to be talking about the really bad ones. There's always been, just like now, there's always been some Arab people, maybe not a country, maybe a group, that were firing rockets into Israel somewhere, somehow. Well, it was a really tough war. Israel was obviously a very young nation. They were not well supplied. The United States did not supply anything to Israel in the war effort. You say, why not? Think Arab oil. That's why. When they began to think about the United States supplying, now when I say that, that doesn't mean that United States citizens didn't participate. I'm talking about going through Congress saying, we will supply arms or men for the war. That's what I mean by the United States. There were Americans that went and helped in the war effort. So make that clear. But the United States, Saudi Arabia, one of them being, said, if you help Israel, you can forget buying oil from us. And so that's kind of what that was going on at that time. Next slide. The Brits, the British, the UK, they actually was, I don't know if they purposefully did this, but let's remember that the British, Jordan and Egypt were both colonies of Britain pre-World War II. And they had just recently, Jordan received their independence just a few days, not too many days before Israel declared themselves as a nation. Israel was getting, the Brits were getting out of the colonization business. And so a lot of these countries, like Egypt was a British colony, Jordan was a British colony, and they had British tanks and British airplanes and British guns, and they were British trained. So the Brits actually, maybe they wanted to, maybe they didn't, but they actually supported the enemies of the war effort against Israel. But Israel squeaked out a victory, and I say only by God's providence and goodness did they do that. There's some really interesting stories of how things happened, and you can almost see the hand of God at work because they were well outnumbered. And they didn't have an air force. They basically had a few army jeeps and a couple of tanks and some slingshots. That's about all they had to fight these, but they won. And not only did they win, but they gained property in this battle. It's the beginnings. We think this has always been words like West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights. Now, that's just always been around. No, it got started, and these terminologies got started around this time, around the beginning of Israel as a nation. I'm going to go ahead and say this, and I'll come back to that, but it also is the beginning of the refugee problem, the Palestinian refugees, which is still a news item today. And you will hear people say the Palestinian refugee problem is Israel's fault. We're going to talk about that tonight. Next slide. So here are some visuals, kind of help you see. So this is kind of busy, so it's got a lot of stuff going on. So over on I got my pointer. So over on your, your left-hand side, this is what Israel, in the blue, this is what Israel looked like in 1947. This was the lines that the United Nations drew. Remember last thing I said? That ain't nothing but a mess. That's not a country, that's a mess. I mean, look how close it comes right here. I mean, that's basically cutting this country in 3 different sections. And there's not very many people down here. This is all desert. Now, after the agreement, the armistice of 1949, this is the agreements, the truce, that's the word that just simply means truce. After the 1948 war, it ended in July of 1949, and Israel started beginning to sign these, not peace treaties, but just basically saying, we won't shoot at you anymore. And notice the difference. This is the orange. That's what Israel gained in the 1948 war. How they won, only God. Only God. Because, well, everybody said, the whole world said, in a week there will be no Israel. I mean, that was even said at the United Nations when they were having all of their meetings and stuff. And I don't remember who said it, but one of the people who was representing said, it doesn't make any difference if they become a nation or not. the Arabs are going to wipe them off the map. And that was the world opinion. So when they won in 1948, everybody stood up and took notice. Next slide. There we go. So now we have, just point out some things. Golan Heights, Israel controls that today. But this was in the hands of the Syrians. So Syria is right up in here. This was Syrian territory. So Israel took that from Syria. The West Bank, we still talk about, this was in Jordan. So the Jordanians, this was their property. Israel took that. They took a portion, the west side of Israel. They took Jerusalem. They took a portion of Jerusalem. I don't know that it was half the city, but a portion of Jerusalem in 1948. And then this is Gaza, which they did not take this from Egypt, but they pushed all of the Egyptian soldiers out of that area. They pushed them back. They didn't occupy it, but they did push them back out of there, away from their borders. So that's how it ended in 1948. Questions? Next slide. Now, I certainly, if y'all hadn't figured this out, I'm pro-Israel. But at the same time, I think what we need to do as God's people and Christians, I called your attention to the podcast done by Christianity Today called The Promised Land. It takes them forever to get a new episode out. They have 4 episodes out right now, and you should listen to that. And it does give the Arab perspective. There are a lot of Arab Christians over there. Now you might say, yeah, but they're Lutheran or they're Episcopalian or they're Armenian or whatever. Well, they claim the name of Jesus Christ. I'm not going to judge whether they're saved or not, but they're not Muslims, they're not Judaistic, but they claim the name of Jesus Christ. And furthermore, they're humans. So we have to kind of think, these are human beings. And now there's evil over there. I mean, we know that. There's evil over there. But there are also some people who are Arabs that are just quite honestly caught in the crossfire. There are some Arab people that would love to get along with the Jewish people and cooperate with the Jewish people. We talked about there are Arab Israeli citizens. There are Arab Israelis who serve in the Israeli parliament. There are Arab Israeli doctors. There are Arab Israeli lawyers. There are Arab Israeli restaurant owners. And there are Arab Israeli tour guides. So was y'all's tour guide Arab? He was Jewish. A lot of your Israeli tour guides are Arab Christians. The couple of guys that I know that have led a bunch of tours over there, they always ask for, and I can't remember, of course he has an American name and then he has a Arab name, but he's an Arab Christian. And they always ask for him. One of the reasons they ask for him is because he knows where not to take them in Arab quarters. So he's pretty safe with them. And if they do get some issues with the Arab people, he's pretty good at talking his way out of a mess. But they usually don't have that. I understand the problem that's going on over there. Put it in our backyard. Sometimes we get a little bit uneasy about the immigration problem that we have in our country. The Jews were immigrating. The European, the Russian Jews were immigrating into this land. So I do want to sympathize with the Arab people, but the Jews did nothing wrong. They didn't steal land. They didn't come in and run people out of their home. They went in and they bought property, and they went into places where land was just desolate because it was not being farmed or used. And they came in and they, as I said, they made that desert blossom like a rose. And so if our world should be ran by laws, then the Jews didn't do anything illegal. The United Nations, back to that decision, they gave the Arab Palestinians the opportunity. Go back another slide where my maps were, if you will. Next one, back one, right there. So all this pink stuff, it's a mess too, but all that pink stuff was to be given to the Arab Palestinians so they too could form their own nation. But here was the problem. They had absolutely no leadership. They fought each other just as much as they fought the Jews. They were very tribal. They had a bunch of little warlords that couldn't get along. And they had all of these little Arab cities, and they had this one chieftain, and he ruled over that city, and he wouldn't cooperate with the next guy, and wouldn't cooperate with the next guy, and so they wouldn't play the game. They wouldn't abide by the rules of the United Nations, and so that's where they are still today. That's where they are, and I feel for the Arab people. Because they're caught in a mess of, they have no one that they can, Yasser Arafat, really? That's the best they've got. Now he's gone now, but go back to my slides, if you will. Thank you. So next slide. The Jews, on the other hand, they were organized, they were determined, they were desperate. So we talked about this, but the Russians didn't want them. The Germans didn't want them. The Spaniards didn't want them. Hey, the Brits didn't want them. And let's not be too on our high horse. Back during that time, we didn't want them either. There were a lot of immigrants, Jewish immigrants, and how did we treat them? We don't go back that far, but that's why we got, and most of them were up in New York area, but we got little, are those cities or queens? What do they call them? Boroughs. And so they were basically Jewish quarters. They said, you can live here, the Bronx, but you can't live over there. So anti-Semitism, definitely. And that's what the first guy, the father of Zionism, I'll call his name later. He basically said to the European nations, he said, who wants us? Will you let us live in your country? If you won't let us live in your country, then let us have our own country. And so that's kind of, and so they just said, we've got to, we have no one to depend on but God and ourselves. And so they got busy, and they turned that land into a profit. The kibbutz, you're probably hearing that terminology on the news. What's a kibbutz? It's a group of people that farm together. It's very socialist, but these people come together, they live together, they take care of their children together, they eat together. It's a little bit different now, but back earlier, it was like going to church camp, living in dorms, eating in the mess hall, and then the rest of the day you went out to the fields and you farmed. And they had them all over. And it was very profitable. It wasn't subsistent farming. They started raising cotton. They started raising different kind of orchards, almonds, a lot of different things that they raised over there, olives, of course. And they farmed them, and they made money. They set up a government. the Jewish Agency. They began to organize a military. They did not have a official military until Ben-Gurion basically twisted their arms and said, these militia groups who had been working to protect a lot of these Jewish settlements, Ben-Gurion basically got a hold of them about 1943 or 4 and basically said, you are now the Jewish army. And he got them to work together, and it was a ragamuffin group, I tell you, but they won the war. But the Jews, God, them, I can't speak with authority there, but this is the reason they succeeded, as opposed to the Arabs. Next slide. Arab refugees. So during the 1948 war, there were somewhere in the neighborhood of, depends on who you read after, about 700,000 Arab people who were displaced from their homes. Some of them chose to leave because of war. Some of them were told to leave by invading Arab armies. They said, you better get out of here or you'll get killed. And so the number, 700,000, and they went to the borders. A lot of them went to Jordan, West Bank area. And that no doubt, I have no doubt in my mind that there were cases where Israeli soldiers went into Arab settlements and ran those people out. It's called war. I mean, it's hard to be nice in a war. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, I know that we modern day Americans have a really hard time stomaching war, but what do you do in a war? You kill people and break things. That's what you do in a war. And so we'll get into some of that later, but Israel tries to be humanitarian in their war efforts, but it's still war. Now, after the war, so put yourself in Israel's shoes. We're American. Let's just presume that we go to war with Canada. And Canada, well, let's do it the other way. Canada comes down and attacks us. And we go up there, and there's Canadians in places like Michigan, in places like Maine, in places like Washington, and all these border states, and we run them all out. Now we got Canadian refugees. The war's over. How quickly are we going to let the Canadians back in? How do you know if they're friend or enemy? This is where Israel was in 1948-49. All of these Palestinians wanted to come back. And they were like, whoa, wait a minute. We're not so sure about that. Was that the right decision? I have absolutely no idea. I just know that if my neighbor's shooting at me and then I run my neighbor off, I'm going to be a little bit reluctant to let him come back because I don't want him to shoot at me no more. This is what they're dealing with. Next slide. Now, you probably heard about this. It's the United Nations Relief and Workers Agency for Palestine. UNRWA. It was formed in December of 1949, the United Nations effort to take care of these Palestinian refugees. The first time in history and the only time ever have a group of people had their own branch, their own special agency in the United Nations to take care of them. I don't know what the motivation is, but it happened. Today, there is approximately $1.2 billion spent on these Palestinian refugees. The United States spends approximately $350 million of it. The next closest to the United States is Britain, and they're at like $150 million. So we spend twice as much as any other country taking care of Palestinian refugees. Now, quite honestly, as I've read and tried to understand, there are Arab nations that are basically blackmailing us and basically saying, if under Donald Trump, he went to the United Nations and he said, we're fixing to quit giving this $350 million. And the Arab nations basically said, if you do, there will be a terrorist strike in your country in short order. If you do, you can forget buying oil from us. This is called international policy. This is how it works, unfortunately, in a sinful world. Today, there are approximately 5.6 million Palestinian refugees. How did 700,000 in 1949 become 5.6 million today? You get to inherit your refugee status. So if my daddy and my grandpa were refugees, I get to be a refugee too. And it's passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation, and they multiply. Is that fixing a problem? That's not fixing a problem. That is creating a problem. Next slide. It's an international welfare system. And there's a lot of hands involved. And I want to try to be as correct as I possibly can be. So I'm not going to say nearly all I want to say, but there's a lot of crooked and evil people over there in the Middle East that are making a fortune off of Palestinian refugees. And the money's not somehow getting to the refugees. It might be given to an entity that provides water for the refugees. But man, they're selling that water for $10 a bottle. Can you imagine somebody doing that? There's crooked people making big money off of keeping Palestinian refugees. Just the facts. The Arab countries do not want to solve the refugee problem. Two things. They don't want the Palestinian refugees in their country. I forget when it was, but it was back in the 2000s and 10s, something like 2013, 14, 15, something like that. And the United Nations tried to work with Syria and Jordan to say, let's work to get these people acclimated into a country like Jordan and Syria, put them to work, like give them Jordanian citizenship, give them Syrian citizenship. And both of those countries said, no way are we doing that. So you say, Israel doesn't want them, Arab countries don't want them, and that's what we're dealing with. So Arab countries have used threats of boycotts, terrorism to the U.S. and the U.K., who have sought to end this international support of Arab refugees. So it kind of irks me a little bit when I see on college campuses these students crying out for the Palestinian refugees. I just want them to read. I just want them to read on the internet and read some of the history of this stuff. Whose fault is the Palestinian refugees? Who was the attacker in 1948? What did Israel want in 1948? You can read it in their Declaration of Independence. They said, we want to work with the Arab people to be peaceful and to exist side by side and to work together to make both of our countries prosperous and to join in economic endeavors and to make our countries, both countries, thrive and survive. You know what the Arabs said? We want to kill Jews. That's what they said. And so when some of these students on college campuses crying out for the Palestinian refugees, and I too feel in my heart the humanitarian needs and efforts of those people who have been abused. I care for them. They're human beings. But it's not Israel's fault. That's what irks me. It's not Israel's fault. But they're the ones being blamed for it. Next slide. All right, let's talk about other wars. As I say here at the beginning, there's been war in this area forever. Let's start with the Sinai War of 1956. These are just highlights. These are just the big ones. So what Egypt did, starting right after 1948, really. So Egypt owns the Suez Canal. I should have put a map up of this. So if you think about the Sinai Peninsula, wait a minute. Does my other map show that? Yeah, let's stay right there. So this right here is the Sinai Peninsula. This is the Gulf of Aqaba. Notice that Israel touches this. Israel has a port right here called Aqaba. This is the Gulf of Suez, Suez Canal right here. We're talking about waterways. Egypt is here. Egypt controls, Egypt actually owns this. Egypt owns this. So at any time, Egypt can shut down the Suez Canal. There's a little bit of international control of that now. But back then, when Egypt says, you ain't going through the Suez Canal, you ain't going. So they did that. They shut down the Suez Canal to Israeli ships. There is a little area right down in here. This is Egypt. Right down in here, I forgot what it's called, but it's called a strait. They put a blockade right here, cutting off Israel to their port. They shut them down. It would be like somebody taking control and shutting off I-30, I-40. So you can go back to the next slide. What did Israel do? They forced the hand. And they sent troops down to the Suez Canal along with France and Britain. And this is the Sinai War. The blockade was opened somewhat. UN forces. This is one of the first times that the United Nations, I'm on slide number 13. This is the first time that the United Nations deployed military forces under the United Nations to protect that Suez Canal. Next one, we've probably heard of this one, the Six-Day War. It's rather popular. It never stopped. You can look through that was 1956, now we're at 1967. It was just always tension, always tension. So Egypt was coming from the south. They actually told, by way of threat, the United Nations forces at the Suez Canal, get gone or we're fixing to kill you. And the United Nations forces withdrew. This is all down in Syria. And so here comes the Egyptian forces across the Sinai Peninsula over to Israel. Syria up in the north began to come down into Galilee, Sea of Galilee area. And they were stationing forces right on Israel's border. Jordan from the west, crossing the Jordan River, coming over and stationing troops right there on the west. The Mediterranean Sea was full of warships, Egyptian, Syrian, Libyan warships, and they were just surrounding Israel. And so I can remember my grandpa telling me one time, my grandpa always said, avoid a fight if at all possible. But if you feel like you have to get in a fight, you get the first lick in first. And that's what Israel did. They took about 185 jets, and they bombed Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and basically eradicated their air forces in one day. And then the rest of it was basically they just kept pushing them back. And you see all the countries. I listed the countries for you. These were the Arab countries aligned against Israel from about 1965 up to when Israel attacked in 1967. Israel gets blamed for this because they threw the first punch. But it was basically, we're either going to throw the first punch or we're going to have a bunch of Jews killed. And they just made the decision, we're going to strike first, and they did. And they won the war in 6 days. Overwhelmingly. Anybody remember that? I hate to show your age, but do y'all remember the news about all that? The amazing and all the... Anybody want to comment on that? Yeah. We got a microphone?
No, the general with the eye patch.
Patton?
No.
No, who is?
The Israeli general.
Oh.
I always remember him because he had an eye patch.
Who was it? I don't know. Y'all have to look that up. Look it up on your phones. What?
Moshe Dayan.
Thank you, Pat.
Is there a prize?
Say it in a microphone.
Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan.
Oh, if you say. What you say.
I say.
I'm with you. I don't know.
You're showing your age.
I was born in 1970, so, but I've heard about it all my life, and I mean, boy, I tell you what, the theologians, 1948 for sure, but 1967 theologians, man, this was the beginning of the tribulation period. Everybody thought. You remember that, Brother Owen? That was the beginning of the tribulation period. Everybody thought that. It turned out not to be. So you just don't ever know. The United States did help Israel in this one. There had been, I don't want to get too much into this, there had been a arms embargo placed upon the Middle East. Now let's understand, there is the United States of America government, and then there are a whole lot of companies out there that make military stuff. But the United States said, you will not sell arms to Israel. But not everybody obeys the rules, right? And for some reason, Israel had a lot of American-made stuff. Have no idea how it got over there, but they had a lot of American-made stuff. So that was helpful, but it was an amazing event. They increased their land holdings once again. Next slide. So this is a picture of Israel. Now I want you to notice this. This is Israel, this darker purple looking. That's Israel 1949 to 1967. This is Israel after 1967. Let's talk about what they won. They won the entire Sinai Peninsula. All of it. And controlled it until 1978. They controlled, this was Egypt's, and they got it all. They won and controlled this place we know as the West Bank. They took it from Jordan. They won the Gaza Strip, which was Egypt's territory. They won the Golan Heights, which was Syrian territory. I think it's something like increased their land mass by 70-something%. Next slide. The United Nations called in Israel. They just embarrassed the Arab countries. Now, I want you to listen to this, because I think this shows the heart of Israel versus the heart of the Arab countries. I'm not saying all Jews versus all Arabs. I'm saying the governments, okay? The United Nations called them in, and they made a resolution, and they said, here's an idea. Let's offer the Arab people their land back for peace. And you may have heard on the news, land for peace. That's what they're talking about. We will trade you land if you will not shoot at us. And Israel said, we'll do it. We'll do that. They went to Egypt and they offered them Sinai. They went to Jordan, they offered them the West Bank. They went to Syria, offered them the Golan Heights. They were willing to go back to where they were, 1949, with 70% less land, if the Arabs would say, sign a peace treaty. Initially, not a one of them agreed. And there was this big rallying cry. No peace with Israel. No peace with Israel. Y'all remember that? That's 1970s. No peace with Israel. That's what the Arabs said. We will not sign a peace treaty with Israel. Egypt eventually does. 1978. Israel gives back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, 1978. Their president, Sadat, Anwar Sadat, they killed him for that. The Islamic Brotherhood killed him for signing a treaty with Israel. The Islamic Brotherhood claimed it. They assassinated the president of Egypt in 1978. Just a few weeks, months later, they killed him. The Islamic Brotherhood, they still exist, and they still are in Egypt. And there's a lot of evil right there, buddy. A lot of evil. Next slide. The Yom Kippur War of October of 1973. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. We know that from Exodus. This is one of the most holiest days, or it is the holiest day in all of Israel. It's the time when the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies, offers a sacrifice. Of course, he couldn't do that in 1973. There was no Holy of Holies, but they did have ways to commemorate this day and to speak of this day. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, all came against Israel in 1973 with the intent to take back the land. Now, here's what I want you to hear. The Arab countries chose war over peace to regain their land. Israel offered it to them. Sign a peace treaty with us, and you can have it. Egypt, they signed a peace treaty. They got Sinai back. They own it today. They own the Suez Canal today. All of this blockade stuff that they keep talking about over with Hamas and Gaza, it's not just Israel blockading. Egypt is blockading as well because they own the Suez Canal now. But the Arab countries, this was striking to me. The Arab countries chose war over peace to regain their land. Doesn't that say something? Doesn't that say something about them? This is what I've seen. And I've read Jewish books, I've read Arab books. And Israel's not a perfect nation, nor is the United States. But Israel has bent over backwards time and time again to try to establish peace with those Arab people. Arab governments, let me say that correctly. There are some Arab people over there that would love to have peace. There's something else to that. Well, I'm running out of time, but y'all might remember this. This was also a little bit of a practice round between the United States and the Soviet Union. Who was the Soviet Union backing? The Arabs. The United States was backing the Israelis. There was a little bit of a sparring back and forth between the United States and the Soviet Union, and this is when the United Nations got involved and they said, we have got to shut this down before it becomes a world war. Next slide. Lebanon War, 1982. This is where the PLO gets involved. The PLO got its start in the 1960s. It was led eventually by Yasser Arafat. It was located in Lebanon, and ever since it got started, it attacked. It attacked all that northern region up around Lebanon, and so Israel basically got tired of it, and they went into Lebanon and they ran the PLO out. Read about it. Israel probably went a little bit too far this round. They actually gained southern Lebanon, which is north up around Damascus. Well, Damascus is over in Syria, but it's up around what is in the Bible times just around Tyre and Sidon area. And it was just in 2000 that Israel pulled out of Lebanon. They probably maybe overstepped their bounds a little bit there. We can maybe have that discussion. But from this point forward, from about the mid-80s, 90s forward, it has become less Israel versus Lebanon, Syria, Iran countries. And now it is Hamas, Hezbollah, the Islamic Brotherhood, terrorist organizations. And guess who's paying for them? Where's the money train? Trace the money train through Hezbollah, and where do you end up? Iran. Trace the money train of Hamas, where do you end up? Iran. So now they don't get in trouble with the United Nations, they send these terrorist groups. They're hitmen, is what they are, for these Arab countries. All right, comments or questions? Yes, John Owen. Yes.
Situation. That was the year I started teaching in the seminary.
Wow.
And it was hard to stay on the subjects of the classes.
I bet it was. I bet it was. I remember when I was in seminary when we first went to Desert Storm. And I remember, we talked a lot about, is this it? Because there was terms like Babylon and all of that, and we're like, Babylon, that's Revelation 18. It's going to, so. Other comments, questions? Yes, Miss Carolyn.
Well, I don't want to take up too much time, but all of these Arab nations are Muslims. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Is this an instance where the two factions work together, the Sunni and the Shia?
A common enemy makes friends, but they don't like each other.
They hate each other.
Yeah, Iran and Iraq hate each other. Saudi Arabia and Iran have their own troubles. So a common enemy makes a great friend. But I do want to say, in countries like Jordan, in countries like Syria, and even in countries like what we think of Palestine occupied territory or Israel, there's a lot of Christians. There's a lot of Christians there, and they are to some degree leftovers from some of that early Christianity, biblical Christianity, but also the time when the Byzantine Empire was around, and it was during that time that a lot of these well-known churches, like the Church of the Nativity, I mean, that was built under the Byzantine Empire, which that was the empire that, say what you want to, but they legalized that it became the state religion. It was Catholic. Well, it was Eastern Orthodox for them, but there are some. In fact, well, enough. Doug's got a choir practice tonight. All right, so let's. We'll pick it up next time. Yes.
Sorry. You mentioned that if they had a common enemy,
Yeah.
they could be friends.
Yeah.
Well, didn't the Pharisees and Sadducees do that
Same.
against Jesus?
Same. Yep. Okay, let's make some announcements. For this coming Thursday, senior adults are going to have a game day fellowship 2 to 4 p.m. Everybody's welcome. Come. It's in the fellowship hall. This coming Sunday, Brother Alejandro Marino is organizing a outreach event. We'll start. I'll get with Alejandro and I'll have more details for you Sunday. But it's at 4 p.m. and we're going to go out into some of the Hispanic communities, and he's going to tell us how it all works. Wednesday of the 24th, that's next Wednesday, they changed up some stuff on me. I sat on the Sunday school committee down in Texarkana, and I've got to go to Texarkana next week. And I can't be a complainer because I live about an hour and a half away. And we've got guys coming from Washington State and from South Carolina and Florida and a lot of different places. But they've decided to move Tuesday, Wednesday instead of Monday, Tuesday. So as a result, it's going to be iffy if I can get back to church in time on Wednesday. Just depends on how long the meetings go. So in my place, I've asked Brother Alejandro Marino to teach for me this next Wednesday night. Going to be an open subject. I told him you choose whatever you want to choose, and so be a good opportunity for him, good opportunity for you. Vacation Bible School, we're still asking for more volunteers. Sign up is on the bulletin board. Any other announcements?
On the Vacation Bible School, we still need a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 5-year-old, first grade, and we need 2 people in head of games, 1 in head of music, and we need people for food teams.
Okay, you heard that, so please help us. It takes a church to put on Vacation Bible School. All right, any others? Okay, then I'll say goodnight to our online audience. Thank you for being here with us tonight. Prayer requests send them our way. We'll help you pray for your prayer concerns.